The IRS auditor arrived at my candle shop carrying a slim gray file and a question nobody outside my family should have known to ask. Not about sales tax, not about payroll, not even about cash deposits in general. She stepped through the front door at 10:12 on a Tuesday morning, showed me her credentials and said, "Ms. Rowan, I'd like to discuss the period when your business briefly operated out of the detached studio behind your mother's house." I didn't answer right away, because that was year one, the year before the storefront, before wholesale accounts, before the regional gift fair, before I hired anyone, back when I was pouring soy candles on folding tables in a converted backyard studio with space heaters that tripped the breaker if I ran them with the wax melter. Very few people even remembered that version of the business. One of them was my stepfather. The auditor's name was Denise Hart. Mid-50s, careful voice, not unfriendly. The kind of person who probably got mistaken for harmless right before she ruined someone's quarter with a spreadsheet. My assistant Cora looked up from the wrapping station. I said, "Cora, can you take the back orders and give us the office?" Cora nodded, shut the stockroom door behind her, and left me standing in my own front workspace with an IRS auditor and a pulse that had suddenly gone very steady. Not calm, steady, there's a difference. I owned a small candle and home fragrance company in Savannah. We did well, not empire well, real well. The kind built on actual invoices, long nights, holiday markets, wholesale risk, shipping mistakes, and 1,000 tiny decisions nobody applauds because they're too busy enjoying the result later. Everything ran through my books, every retail sale, every wholesale deposit, every contractor payment for the storefront build-out. My accountant was obsessive. I kept backups of backups. So when Denise Hart introduced herself and said there were questions arising from a third-party submission, I wasn't afraid of my records. I was afraid of the source. My stepfather, Glenn Mercer, had hated my business from the moment it became real enough to count. When I started it, he called it melted wax with branding. When I landed my first hotel account, he called it luck. When I opened the shop, he told my mother I'd get humbled by inventory math before Christmas. He'd been in my life since I was 14, long enough to learn my habits, my soft spots, my numbers, and exactly what kind of damage a man like him could do if he ever wanted to sound informed. He also hated one thing more than my business succeeding, the fact that my mother quietly helped me in the beginning. Not with money. She never had any control over money while Glenn was around, but with space. She let me use the detached studio behind the house after work. That alone enraged him. He used to stand in the back doorway and say things like, "Just remember, all this hobby income gets ugly when the government notices." He said it often enough that when Denise Hart stood in my shop and mentioned the studio behind my mother's house, I knew. He had reported me. "May I see the file?" I asked. Denise did not hand it over, but she opened it and sat down at the small consultation table near the front window. "This is a civil audit review," she said, "at the moment." At the moment. I took the seat across from her. She began with routine questions first, which told me she knew how to give bad morning structure. When was the business formed? Who prepared the returns? When did I move from home production to rented commercial space? Did I maintain separate business accounts from inception? Yes. Yes. Year 3. Yes. Then she asked, "During the first 18 months, did you ever receive large unreported cash infusions from family members or root business funds through personal accounts? No? Did you conceal inventory purchases by paying vendors through relatives? No. Did anyone in your household at the time have signing access to your startup bank account? No." She made a note. Then she asked, "Did you ever reimburse Glenn Mercer for materials, utility costs, or storage in cash?" There it was, not a guess, not a generic question, a family question. Glenn used to complain constantly that I owed him for electricity because my wax melter raised the backyard utility bill. He never got money from me for it. He just brought it up often enough that he could later turn the memory into a narrative. "No," I said. And to be clear, Glenn Mercer was never part of my business. Denise looked up. So you know who I mean. I held her gaze. I know who would file this. That earned the first change in her expression all morning. Not agreement, not exactly. Just the look people get when your answer fits too neatly into what they've already been reviewing. She turned one page in the file. The submission included spreadsheets. An account references and assertions that your reported income in the early years was materially understated. I nodded once. That's false. Do you have records from that period? Yes. How complete? Complete enough that if someone's inventing numbers from my first year, I want to know what they attached. Denise sat back slightly. The sales floor was quiet beyond the office window. I could hear Cora laughing softly with a walk-in customer near the register, and that normal little sound almost made the room feel stranger. My whole life was 8 feet away. Gift boxes, invoices, a display of cedar and orange holiday jars, while the federal government sat in my shop asking about the backyard studio at my mother's house. Denise tapped the file with one finger. I cannot disclose the identity of a reporting party, she said. Now, I had expected that. So I asked the question that actually mattered. What did they attach? She opened the file again, this time slower. There are bank records, she said. That made me go still. Not because I was hiding anything, because Glenn should not have had any legitimate bank records of mine. He never had access to my business account, never signed on it, never handled my deposits. He barely even understood how I priced wholesale. The only way he could have produced real bank material was if he sent something that wasn't mine. I said, "Whose bank records?" Denise looked down again. Then she paused. A real pause this time, long enough that I could hear the front bell ring as another customer came in. She turned the page toward herself, read one line, then another, and for the first time her whole manner changed. Not suspicious anymore. Interested. Then she looked up at me and lowered her voice. "This includes 10 years of statements," she said quietly. I stared at her. 10 years. My business was only 7 years old. That was when Denise Hart looked from the file to me, then back to the attached account summary, and whispered the sentence that made my stomach drop for an entirely new reason. "Who sent these in?" I didn't answer Denise right away, because I already knew the first part. If the attachment packet included 10 years of bank statements, they weren't mine. My business was 7 years old. Before that, I was pouring candles in a backyard studio, working part-time at a hotel spa counter, and stretching every dollar until it made a sound. There was no hidden decade of secret revenue because there was no decade of business. So either the person who filed the tip had attached the wrong records, or attached exactly the records they meant to. I said, "Can I see the account holder names?" Denise hesitated. Then she turned the file just enough for me to read the top line on one attachment summary. The statements were not in my name. They were in Glenn Mercer's. Not personal only either. There were 2 sets, one from a personal checking account, another from an old business account tied to Mercer Outdoor Supply, the landscaping and hardscape company Glenn used to brag about as if he'd built the interstate system by hand. I sat back slowly. Those were his records, not mine. Denise watched my face closely. "You recognize the name?" "Yes," I said. "That's my stepfather." She tapped the page again. "Then tell me something important. Why would a submission alleging you concealed business income include a decade of his statements?" I almost laughed, but it came out as breath instead. Because Glenn only understood finance one way. If money moved through a room he had once stood in, he thought part of it belonged to him. When I started the business behind my mother's house, he used to say things like, "All this little side cash gets muddy if it passes through family utilities." At the time, I thought it was posturing. Glenn liked to sound one sentence away from a tax seminar if it made other people feel underinformed. Now, sitting across from the IRS, I realized he had spent years building a private story where my business and his money had touched often enough for him to later call the whole thing suspicious. Only his own statements were sitting in the file. Denise opened another sheet. This submission claims that in your early years, you routed undeclared cash to Glenn Mercer as reimbursement for utilities, storage, packaging purchases, and vendor pickups. That never happened. She nodded once. The trouble for whoever wrote that is timing. She turned the page toward herself and read from her notes. Cash deposits in these statements begin 3 years before your business existed. Same pattern, same branch regions, same amounts clustering below formal review thresholds. The room got very quiet. I knew what she meant. Not enough to sound like a textbook, but enough. Repeated cash deposits, rounded amounts. Just under the kind of number that made banks or auditors ask sharper questions. And 3 years before I had ever sold a single candle. Denise looked up. Denso, unless you were running a fragrance company before you legally became an adult, these records do not support the allegation against you. I said, no, they support something else. That was the first time she almost smiled, not because it was funny, because it was clean. She pulled out the attached spreadsheet that came with the submission. It was supposed to map my early business activity against Glenn's deposits, wax purchases, weekend markets, holiday sales, cash reimbursements. But once you saw the dates, the whole thing sagged under its own stupidity. There were business reimbursements listed from a period when I was still working hotel shifts and buying wax in 12-pound boxes online. One line even claimed I'd paid Glenn monthly storage offset cash, a full year before my mother ever let me use the backyard studio. He built the narrative backward, Denise said quietly. Yes, I said. That sounds like him. There was another problem, too. She showed me the oldest statement in the packet. Top right corner, mailing address, my mother's house. The same house where Glenn still lived. The same house where he kept a locking file cabinet in the garage office and acted like every paper inside it was state property, which meant he had gathered 10 years of his own statements, attached them to a tip meant to implicate me, and apparently believed nobody at the IRS would check whether his deposits predated my company. That level of confidence was so specifically Glenn, it made my skin crawl. Denise closed the file halfway. I need a clean timeline from you. Formation date, first account, first lease, first payroll. Oh, also, the period you used the detached studio and the nature of your agreement to use it. There was no agreement. Verbal permission? My mother let me work there after Glenn complained for 2 months. Did you ever pay him rent? No. Utilities? No. Cash? No. Anything that would explain his deposits? No. She wrote fast. Then she asked, did he ever pressure you to run money through his accounts? That one surprised me. Not because it was inaccurate, because I hadn't thought about it in years. Once, only once during my first holiday season, after a market weekend went better than expected, Glenn told me I should let him hold some of the cash so it didn't make my numbers look too good before I had real tax strategy. I said no. He called me arrogant and didn't speak to me for 2 days. I told Denise that. And she stopped writing for a second, then asked, any messages? No, he said it in the garage. Witnesses? My mother, maybe. She was inside. Denise nodded. Then she opened one final attachment and went still again. What? I asked. She angled the page toward me. It was a photo, a yellow legal pad in Glenn's handwriting. I knew the handwriting because he wrote grocery lists like he was drafting threats. On the page were columns of dates, deposit amounts, and little notes beside them. Wax holiday jars, craft fair cash hold. But the top entries were from years before I ever had a business. And at the bottom of the photo, barely visible beyond the pad, was the corner of Glenn's bank statement, showing the same account number from the attached records. Denise looked up at me and lowered her voice again. If this is what I think it is, your stepfather didn't just send in a bad tip, she said. He sent us a private ledger explaining his own cash deposits. I stared at the page. Then my phone buzzed on the table between us. Mom. I silenced it. A second later, she texted, do not say anything to the IRS about Glenn until we talk. He's already in enough trouble. I showed Denise the text from my mother. She read it once, then held out her hand. "May I?" I gave her the phone. She read the message again, slower this time. "Do not say anything to the IRS about Glenn until we talk. He's already in enough trouble." Then she set the phone down between us and said, "That is a very unfortunate sentence." For him? For anyone trying to argue this was a good faith misunderstanding. She copied the text into her notes word for word. Then she looked at me and asked, "Wait, does your mother usually say he's already in enough trouble when tax questions come up?" "No," I said. "She usually says not to upset him before dinner." That almost got a smile out of her. Almost. My phone rang again. "Mom." Denise looked at the screen, then at me. "Answer it." Speaker. I did. My mother didn't say hello. "Have you spoken to them?" "I'm speaking to one of them now." She went quiet for half a second, then lower. "You need to be careful what you say about Glenn." Denise had already opened her yellow pad again. "Why?" I asked. "Because he was trying to help you." I looked at Denise. Denise looked at me. Help. There it was. Family fraud's favorite word. How exactly was he helping me? I asked. Mom exhaled shakily. "So by organizing the early cashiers, so your numbers wouldn't look sloppy." "My business account existed from the start." "That's not what Glenn means." "Then what does he mean?" Another pause. Then my mother said the sentence that finally told me how far this had gone. "He means if there were deposits in his accounts that lined up with your markets and early sales, it would be kinder to say you reimbursed him and no one understood the timing." Denise stopped writing only long enough to look up at me. Kinder. Not truer. Kinder. I kept my voice level. "Mom, those deposits start before my business existed." She whispered. "I know." That landed harder than I expected. Not because I thought she was innocent, because she had known. Maybe not every detail, maybe not every statement, but enough to know the story Glenn wanted was impossible on the calendar alone. "He is scared," she said. "That's all this is." "No," I replied. "That's not all this is." Then she made it worse. "Sloan, please, if they ask, just say he sometimes mixed your little business cash with his because he was trying to keep household things stable." Little business cash. There it was again. The old insult wearing a new costume. Even now, with an IRS auditor listening, my mother couldn't stop shrinking what I built if it made Glenn sound larger. Denise leaned toward the phone and said, calm as rain, "Mrs. Mercer, this is Denise Hart with the Internal Revenue Service. Do not coach this witness again." My mother gasped. Then the line went dead. The office got very quiet. Denise wrote for another 30 seconds without speaking. And when she finally looked up, her whole posture had changed. The audit was no longer walking in one direction. "She just did two things for me," Denise said. First, she confirmed Glenn is aware of specific records in question. Second, she suggested a false explanatory narrative for deposits that predate your business. I sat back slowly. "So what happens now?" "That depends on how cooperative you want to be." I laughed once. "About my stepfather?" "Extremely." "Good. Because up until that moment, some stubborn private part of me had still been holding on to the idea that Glenn had just taken an ugly swing at me and accidentally hit himself instead. But the phone call clarified it. He wasn't confused. He was building an alibi and trying to fit me inside it. Denise opened the submission metadata on her laptop and turned the screen enough that I could see the attachment properties. The bank statements had been scanned in batches over 2 days. The yellow legal pad photo had been created the day before. Submission source. An internet connection registered to Mercer Outdoor Supply. Not anonymous, not careful, not even clever. "He sent it from his own business network?" I asked. "Looks that way." That sounded so exactly like Glenn that I had to close my eyes for a second. My stepfather was the kind of man who believed confidence was a substitute for systems. He still used the same password pattern for everything and wrote numbers on yellow pads like paper itself would protect him. Denise clicked into one more page, then stopped. "What now?" I asked. She turned the monitor farther. Now at the bottom of the submission, attached almost as an afterthought, was a PDF titled House Utility Offsets / Sample Explanation. It was a draft statement, unsigned, written in Glenn's voice so clearly I could hear him in the phrasing. It claimed I had routinely paid him in cash for utilities, storage, and occasional labor support, and that any deposits on his accounts matching my early business cycle were therefore family pass-through reimbursements rather than independent taxable income. Pass-through reimbursements. He had written himself a script, and it was sitting inside the tip packet he sent to the IRS. Denise read it once and closed the file. Then she looked straight at me. I need to ask one more question before I decide how to scope this. Okay. Is there a garage office, file room, or work shed at your mother's house where Glenn keeps original business records? I didn't even have to think. Yes. She nodded slowly. That's what I thought. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't my mother. It was Cora from the front of the shop. Your stepdad is here. He says he needs 5 minutes alone with you before you ruin 2 families. I looked up at Denise. She didn't even blink. Good, she said. Tell your assistant not to let him leave. Cora had spent 3 years at my shop and one brutal holiday season proving she could wrap fragile inventory, calm difficult customers, and stare down men who mistook politeness for softness. So I texted her one sentence. Keep him in front. Say I'm with an auditor and he needs to wait. Cora replied in 3 seconds. Already did. He's pretending to browse diffusers. Aunt Denise closed the file, slid her credentials back into her jacket pocket, and stood. I'm not interviewing him as the reporting party. I'm observing a witness with potential knowledge of submitted materials. That distinction matters. So you can talk to him? I can ask questions. He can answer or make his day worse. We stepped out into the shop. Glenn was standing near the winter display pretending to inspect a cedar sage candle he had once called expensive porch smoke. He turned when he saw me, then noticed Denise half a second later. That was the first crack, not fear, calculation. He smiled anyway. Sloan. Only family used the name my mother still clung to from my first marriage. Everyone else in my life had long since moved on to Rowan. Glenn, I said. He set the candle down carefully. Or your mother said you were overreacting. Denise introduced herself by name and title. His face didn't fully change, but something in his shoulders did. IRS, he said, like the letters offended him. That's right, Denise replied. Glenn gave a short laugh. Well, then maybe I can clear this up. Sloan's business had some messy early years. I tried to help keep the household side clean. Household side. There it was already. The phrase from my mother, but sharpened by his own ego. Denise folded her hands. What kind of help? Cash reimbursements, utilities, storage, pickup runs. Sometimes family keeps things informal before a business is real. My skin went cold. Not because I was surprised anymore. Because he was actually doing it. Standing in my shop, volunteering the false script before anyone even asked the first dangerous question. And Denise kept her tone even. How long did that arrangement last? On and off. How long? He shrugged. A few years. That's vague. He smiled again, but thinner. You know how these little side operations begin. My voice stayed level. No. Tell her how mine began. He ignored me. That told Denise enough to keep going. Do you have records supporting these reimbursements? She asked. Glenn made the mistake of answering too fast. Of course. Then he slowed down, but too late. Where? Denise asked. At home. In your business office? He hesitated, not because he wanted to hide the place, because he wanted to pick which version of the place would sound least incriminating. The garage office, he said finally. "Mostly working files." Denise nodded once, like that confirmed something she'd already suspected. "What kind of files?" He crossed his arms. "This seems excessive for helping my stepdaughter straighten out her books." I almost laughed. He had reported me, sent in a decade of his own bank statements, a handwritten ledger, and a draft script pretending I reimbursed him in cash, and he still wanted to phrase himself as the helper dragged into unfair scrutiny. Denise asked, "Did you submit records to the IRS related to her business?" That was the first question that made him actually blink. "Am I required to answer that?" "No," she said. "But you are currently volunteering explanations for records I have not described in detail, so I'm giving you a chance to be precise." Glenn looked at me then, as if maybe I had the power to stop the ground under him from shifting if he stared long enough. "What did you tell them?" he asked. "I told the truth." He smiled without warmth. "That's usually expensive." Denise stepped in before I could answer. "Mr. Mercer, did you submit documents or not?" He exhaled sharply through his nose. "I submitted concerns, because if she was routing early cash through family overhead, I wasn't going to let that come back on me." There it was, not a denial, a partial confession wearing caution tape. "Routing through family overhead?" Denise repeated. "Define that." He spread one hand. "Using our space, our electricity, our time, bringing in little bundles of cash from market weekends." That was the story, the one he had practiced so hard he almost believed it. Only Denise knew what he didn't. The deposit started before my business existed. She let him keep talking. "When exactly did those little bundles of cash begin?" she asked. He made another mistake. "Before she was even formal." "How long before?" "Maybe 2-3 years." I didn't move. Neither did Denise. Then she asked softly, "Mr. Mercer, are you claiming your stepdaughter generated business cash and reimbursed you years before her company existed?" He went still. For 1 second, the whole shop disappeared for me. No register sounds, no front bell, no Cora wrapping a gift near the counter. Just Glenn, realizing too late that he had finally stepped fully inside his own timeline. "That's not what I said," he snapped. "It is exactly what you said," Denise replied. He turned toward me then, angry enough to forget the room. "You always did this. Twisted words and let people think you were cleaner than everybody." I said, "No, you did that with money." That landed harder than anything else so far. Because his face changed, not dramatically, but enough that Denise saw it. She asked one final question, and it was the right one. "Mr. Mercer, if your records will show legitimate reimbursements from Ms. Rowan, then why did your wife text her this morning not to speak to the IRS because you were already in enough trouble?" He actually took one step back, not from me, from the sentence. That was when Cora quietly locked the front door and flipped the sign to back in 15 minutes. Good woman. Glenn noticed the click and lost the last bit of performance. "This is harassment," he said. "You can't box me in a retail store and act like I'm the criminal." Denise's answer was very calm. "No one said criminal, I said inaccurate. But if you'd like, we can discuss the 10 years of personal and business bank records, the deposit patterns under review thresholds, the handwritten ledger explaining them, and the garage office where you say original files are kept." Glenn's face drained slowly. Then he looked at me. Not angry now, not paternal, not even superior. Scared. For the first time since I was 14, my stepfather looked scared in front of me. He said, too quietly, "You have no idea what you're setting off." Denise replied before I could, "I think she does." Then her phone buzzed. She checked the screen, read one line, and looked up at Glenn. "This just got easier," she said. "What did?" "The bank activity comparison." She held his gaze. "And I now have enough to request formal production on your accounts and business records." Glenn left my shop 20 minutes later without buying anything, without apologizing, and without looking back at me. But he did make one last mistake before he reached the door. He turned to Denise and said, "If you go pulling 10 years of statements over a family misunderstanding, you're going to bury a lot more than a candle business." Denise wrote that down too. Then he walked out into the Savannah heat and got into his truck like a man who still thought motion could substitute for control. It couldn't. Once the door shut behind him, Denise looked at me and said, "Your audit just changed shape." "How?" "You still need to give me your records, and I still need to close the loop cleanly. But the allegation against you is collapsing under the source material." The source material, however, is now very interesting. That was Denise Hart in one sentence. No drama, no gotcha. Just the truth, stripped clean. Over the next 2 hours, and I gave her everything she asked for. Formation documents, first-year bank account, merchant processor history, tax returns, lease dates, wholesale invoices, the timeline for the detached studio. She took copies, matched dates, and built what she called a separation chronology, meaning a record showing where my business money actually lived and where Glenn's money definitely did not. That chronology saved me, and it buried him. 3 days later, Denise came back with a second IRS employee, a bank analysis specialist this time, and asked for one more formal statement from me about Glenn's attempt years earlier to hold some of my holiday market cash. I signed it. Then she told me carefully that my review was being narrowed rather than escalated. Narrowed to what? I asked. "Where to confirmation that your records are clean and that the third-party submission was materially unreliable. Because his records predate my business." "Because of that," she said, "and because the deposits in his accounts don't behave like your sales." She didn't need to say more. I understood enough. My business revenue rose seasonally, then structurally. Holiday spikes, wholesale lumps, predictable merchant settlement patterns. Glenn's statements showed something else entirely. Years of repeated cash deposits in clustered amounts, many sitting just under the threshold that made people ask sharper questions, with rhythms that had nothing to do with my retail cycle, and everything to do with a man moving undeclared cash around his own life. A week after that, my mother called me from the driveway outside my shop. Not inside, outside. And she didn't want witnesses. When I stepped out, she was standing beside her car, twisting her hands together the way she only did when Glenn's problems had finally become large enough to touch her too. "What did you tell them?" she asked. "The truth." Her eyes filled, not with grief, but with exhausted fury. "They were at the house this morning." I said nothing. She filled it because someone always does. "They asked for garage records. They asked for the old business ledgers. They asked why Glenn had cash coming in during years when Mercer Outdoor Supply reported losses." She swallowed. "They even asked about the lockbox." The lockbox. I had forgotten about the lockbox in the garage office, the one Glenn used to treat like a shrine. Petty cash, he always said, emergency float. You never knew with a business, unless, apparently, and someone started asking for 10 years of statements. I looked at my mother and asked the only thing I really wanted answered. "Did you know?" She looked away. Not fully. Just enough. Enough. Not every deposit, not every ledger, not every account, but enough to know his story about me had been built to redirect a light already moving toward him. "He thought if they looked at your startup years," she said quietly, "they'd stop looking at the overlap in his." There it was. Not confusion, not panic, strategy, bad strategy, cruel strategy, but strategy. He had tried to offer me up as explanation, a daughter-shaped shield built out of old access, family knowledge, and the assumption that I would stay quiet to preserve my mother's peace. I didn't. And once I didn't, the entire thing unfolded in the direction it should have from the beginning. And about a month later, Denise called me with the cleanest sentence I heard all year. "Your review is closed with no change. No adjustment, no penalty, no widening inquiry, no mess left hanging over my business. Just clean." Then she added, because she knew I would understand the wording, "The related review is ongoing." Related review, Glenn. By then, I already knew some of what that meant. My mother had stopped pretending otherwise. Glenn's landscaping business accounts had been pulled against the statements he sent in. The yellow pad ledger that was supposed to explain my fake reimbursements ended up serving as an index to his own cash deposits. Several vendor cash expense patterns didn't line up with reported purchases. Personal deposits had been flowing during years his business claimed pressure and thin margins. He had even used the same branch cluster for years, as if routine itself would make the numbers invisible. It didn't. Once the IRS dug through 10 years of his bank statements, they weren't looking at my candle shop anymore. They were looking at Glenn Mercer. And Glenn Mercer, for all his talk, had spent a decade writing himself into his own margins. The ugliest part came later. He didn't scream at me. He didn't show up at my shop. He didn't even call. He sent one email, no greeting, no signature block, just a single line. "You could have kept this in the family." I read it once and deleted it. Because no, I couldn't have. He reported me. He attached his own records. He tried to use my small business as camouflage for his own banking story. All I did was refuse to wear it. In the months after that, things got quieter in the way I now value most, professionally. My audit closed clean, my accountant slept again, and my shop kept growing without that cold federal shadow standing in the doorway. Cora started joking that if we survived the IRS, we could survive holiday shipping. She was probably right. As for Glenn, the review on him did not vanish. It widened. That's all I'll say. No movie ending, no dramatic public arrest in a parking lot. Just the long, serious pressure of record requests, account comparisons, and years of cash behavior finally being forced to explain itself. My mother stayed with him longer than I expected, then stopped talking about misunderstandings. Once, even she couldn't pretend the timeline helped him. The strangest part is this. Glenn tried to ruin my business by making it look sloppy, hidden, and dishonest. And instead, he proved the opposite. My books held, my records matched, my dates were clean. When the government came in asking questions only family would know, the thing that saved me was the same thing he always mocked, my systems. If you made it this far, tell me in the comments. What would you have done if your own stepfather reported your business and the IRS showed up with questions pulled straight from your family history? And which moment hit harder for you? The 10 years of bank statements, your mother's "he's already in enough trouble" text, or Glenn talking himself into the hole right there in the shop? If you liked the story, leave a like, subscribe, and stay with me for the next one.